Okay. Okay. So, bear with me. I just had to re record this. But either way, we move. So, what it do, cosmic kinfolk and comrades? We're close to finishing the first quarter of 2026, and by the ancestors, I'm sure a good amount of us are tired. Yes, tired, with a whole letter T included because the state of the world looks and feels nasty. But I would say this year also feels exciting, which is why I haven't come on here to wax in despair. From the astrologers I follow, the stars reveal a landscape that's interesting to say the least. By now, we've already celebrated the Lunar New Year that ushered us into the year of the fire horse, according to the Chinese astrologers. And the lunar eclipse occurred for this year as well. And most importantly, we're entering a new season. For the Northern Hemisphere, we're going into spring, while the Southern Hemisphere is going through fall. But either way, there's this theme. There's a theme of transformation, whether it be generation or regeneration, or maybe deconstruction. Not only that, Lent is going on, Ramadan just ended, Eid Mubarak to all the homies, Passover is coming, and of course, Easter is coming too. There's just a lot of renewal and refreshing happening right now that's coloring this episode. And I'm going to be honest, getting this episode out is the equivalent of that first root or shoot of a plant bursting from the seed pod and out of the ground or deeper into the ground to get its nutrients. Or it can be kind of like that butterfly climbing out of the cocoon. I know, it's just those sound so typical and cliche, plant and butterfly metaphors for spring, but hey, it fits the topic. In this episode of Dynamic Observations, we will be looking at some important topics and some of my favorite topics. We'll be looking at Solarpunk as an aesthetic and ideology. We'll be looking at Janelle Monae as a liberated artist, and X-Men as a guide to fighting oppression and sometimes winning. Why are we looking at this subject? One, it's because I'm a huge nerd. Philosophy, art, music, comic books. But also, I want to ask some crucial questions at this time in history. What does liberation look like? We can start there, and that's going to offer up a whole lot. But the questions that come after are, what does it look like when people finally reach their promised land of peace and prosperity and empowerment and, being free from the boot of oppression? Are we capable of imagining freedom living in our current reality? And is there only one version of freedom? Now, for that question, I'm going to say no. Just because, while yes, we all live in a reality that's are connected, these realities definitely look different. They might have their themes and whatnot, but they do look different socially speaking. Because freedom for one group of people is of course going to look different because what's weighing on that one group of people is different from what weighs on another group. I think of the colonial uprising against Great Britain, also known as the American Revolution. They wanted to be pushed back. They wanted to push back against Great Britain, and they wanted to write about being free and, everybody being equal. And yet they still maintained chattel slavery. Like, there were people who fought in the revolution, and some of them got their freedom. Historically they did get that, but some of them didn't. A good majority of them didn't. And then the other question is whether or not they kept that freedom. That's another thing. So now these different visions of freedom occur. Like, because what does freedom look like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? Sound like? Feel like? How does it remain? If your freedom can be taken away, how do we feel about that? So these are the questions I want to start with. And yeah, hopefully, are we going to have the answers? I doubt. I don't expect us to have the answers right now, but I just expect us to get the wheels turning. As always, this is just an observation. So first, let's start with what is Solarpunk? So here, for those who don't know, Solarpunk is both an artistic and socio-political genre, usually in science fiction literature and art and media. In the same family as like cyberpunk or steampunk, there is a vein of cultural commentary in Solarpunk. That's where the like punk part comes into play. However, there are some distinct differences. So putting it simply, cyberpunk centers on futuristic and or computerized technological, centered narratives, right? So think of the Ghost in the Machine anime, where it takes place in the future of Tokyo, Japan, a futuristic version, where there are androids and machine humans and whatnot. Or films like the Matrix trilogy, or Blade Runner, or Hackers in 1995, or The Net in 1995. Those are movies that aren't necessarily futuristic. Hackers and The Net. There's movies that just center on technology, being computer technology, being connected to corporations and whatnot, and being an adversarial weapon, if you will. Or even the video game that came out, Cyberpunk 2077. Cyberpunk 2077, really good. I haven't played it, but not big on first-person shooters, but it was a really good event of a game. So like this, but either way, I digress. The aesthetics, the narrative, the themes, all of it centers on technology being deeply intertwined with society and social norms, and a manifestation of that society's ills. Sometimes it's in a futuristic setting relative to our current time, or sometimes it's in a contemporary setting. But there's a theme of technology and cyberspace being this powerful feature. And sometimes it's a negatively powerful feature, or sometimes positively powerful, And then we have Solarpunk. So Solarpunk goes in another direction. It centers on pastoral settings and having technology work in tandem with natural resources and being solar powered, hence the name Solarpunk. And also because solar power is one of the premier forms of, alternative energy sources versus fossil fuel dependency. But it can also include other natural power sources like water, or tidal, energy from the ocean tides, and wind farms that you'll see in the fields, or etc. All the different alternative energy technologies. The genre of solarpunk is rooted in environmentalist practices that push for a future, and as well as a present, of clean air, water, and energy for all people. But one of the key features that separates solarpunk from a genre like cyberpunk is that there's an element of hopefulness and optimism ingrained in the narratives. While a cyberpunk narrative explores how technology can be used to tear humans and society apart, or how people have to fight against those who use technology in violent ways, Solarpunk invites the human imagination to consider how technology can make a future of abundance and beauty and joy. Now, pause for a second. I'm not saying that every Solarpunk narrative is inherently gonna be happy. And just like I'm not gonna say every cyberpunk narrative is gonna be inherently, sad or grungy. It's just these are kind of how these narratives lean. Like I said, I listed off all the examples of the cyberpunk films that existed. And all of those films fall under thriller or fall under, showing how technology is used to cause such harm. I mean, The Net, that stars Sandra Bullock, it talks about identity theft and how a person can take someone's whole life using a computer, right? Like, and this was in the mid 90s. And it's still here. And it talks about how people's reliance on technology and information that's in the computer can often override what they actually see. It can override their perception of reality. Like, how do you prove your identity if someone can go into a computer system and erase all that record of you? And yeah, you have an ID, and look, even if you don't have an ID, now what are you gonna do? How do you prove your identity then? How do you prove you say who you are? And even an ID isn't fail-proof, honestly, because people can make fake IDs. I live in Atlanta. I've seen it happen. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen anywhere else. I'm just saying Atlanta has the stereotype for a reason. But I love Atlanta. No shade. But yeah, solarpunk narratives, on the other hand, that I've read, and maybe if you guys have seen some solarpunk narratives that a little bit end on sad endings or go into, I guess you could say, rougher territory or more emotionally dreadful territory, similar to like The Net or The Matrix, then I'm open to reading them. Send them my way. Here for it. But from what I've seen, solarpunk usually pushes for the future can be happy. The future can be free from exploitation. The future people can enjoy the world, the one world that we know of that supports our life, and still have, a great technological advancement. It's just the technological advancement is accessible to all people. It makes life accessible for all people. And it's just about making life better and people more connected to each other as humans and with all life forms, versus being so enthralled with a machine that you forget real life. It's about making technology support real life. So here's how, with all of that in mind, here's how I'm going to tie that with Janelle Monae and also with X-Men. Now, here's how I tie solarpunk as an aesthetic and an ideology, an artistic genre, if you will, with Janelle Monae. Yeah, we'll start with Janelle Monae first. Because what inspired this connection was her Age of Pleasure album. Now, the Age of Pleasure album was an album made for fun and fun alone, But I think in order to fully appreciate the moment that album came out, we have to look at what came before with Janelle Monae as an artist. Now, who is Janelle Monae? If you ask me, I'll say that Janelle is one of my inspirations. But I'll try not to make this video about me being a stan. So here's a brief overview of her resume. Now, sidebar. Janelle Monae notified the world that they were non-binary in 2022 as they were promoting their project Dirty Computer, and explained their pronouns were they, them, and she and her. I'll try to use they, them more so, but I'll also occasionally say she, her when referring to Monae, because Monae also mentioned that they, will always advocate for Black femininity and Black femme individuals. That is their space. That has been their main target audience, if you will, and their main subject and their main inspiration, right? So like Janelle Monae is a singer, songwriter, rapper, actress, producer, and author. And while their first musical project, The Audition, was released in 2003, which is a good EP, by the way, their musical debut occurred working with the Purple Ribbon All-Stars and Outkast. Monae has deep connections with the Dungeon family in ATL. Okay, she was being featured on the Idlewild soundtrack. Again, if you like Sinners, go watch Idlewild. Just sidebar there, okay? Just saying. And then she's also made a cameo in the Morris Brown music video. Riding in the backseat of that Cadillac. She did her thing with her afro. Loved it. Now, Monae signed to Bad Boy Records in 2006, with Bad Boy helping Monae gain exposure as opposed to artistic development. And that's because, according to the executives, Monae didn't need any development. In 2007, Monae dropped their first official project, which was Metropolis, the Chase Suite, that featured the single Many Moons. And the rest is honestly history at that point. Since then, Janelle Monae has been a master at creating a world with their music, including a fascinating cast of characters and aliases, as well as a thrilling narrative. In a majority of their projects, Monae has combined elements of Afrofuturism, of the golden age of film, and social commentary within a range of musical genres, such as R&B, funk, gospel, rock, and more. But the other prominent aspect of those projects is that they all had a dystopian tone somewhat, either throughout the whole project or on a few tracks. Either way, Janelle Monae has shown a pattern of crafting narratives of resistance, liberation, self-determination, and love. So it's like with Metropolis, the Chase Suite EP, and the ArchAndroid album, they centered on an android named Cindy Mayweather, time traveling and fighting to spread a message of liberation to the people of the past. And this is like where you go into it with, this raises another question. Metropolis, because the name is not a coincidence. She drew inspiration on the movie Metropolis by Fritz Lang. I believe it was filmed in the 1920s. I forget the exact date. But I wonder if you could consider that a cyberpunk film as well, because it supposedly takes place in the future, I believe, and if it doesn't, it also includes elements of science fiction where there's a character named Maria and she gets copied into an android, if you will, that seduces people and whatnot. It, premise-wise, it's pretty fascinating. But yeah, I digress. Back to Janelle Monae. So, after Metropolis, the Chase Suite, and the Arcandroid album, then comes The Electric Lady. And The Electric Lady acted as a sort of prequel for the two previous projects, explaining how the character Cindy Mayweather became a freedom-fighting figure. That's how she used it. That's how she played with the narrative. That's how she, explored it. And then comes Dirty Computer. With Dirty Computer, Janelle Monae moved from the character of Cindy Mayweather to Jane and inserted themselves into the musical spotlight in an effort to showcase their most authentic self. And it's not to say that Janelle Monae was not being authentic in those previous projects. I think Janelle Monae has often been very open and whatnot, but I also think, like most people who are in the spotlight, they reserve a little bit part of themselves for themselves. And I especially think so because at the time when Janelle Monae was coming out, there was speculation as to whether or not she was queer. Is she a lesbian? Because she always wore tuxedos and she wasn't seen dating anybody. You know how the paparazzi was always in somebody's business. But I guess it was business that paid them. I would say mind the business that pays you, but being in other celebrities' business is what paid them, unfortunately. That's another conversation. There might be a next episode. I digress. But with this era, with the Dirty Computer era, Janelle Monae was setting aside the metaphors and symbols and instead presenting themselves in their truth as a queer black femme individual that held the same desire for freedom and love as Cindy Mayweather. While Dirty Computer had more elements of realism, it still held a core narrative of resistance against an oppressive regime illustrated in the music and the visual short film that accompanied it. With this information in mind, Age of Pleasure is a stark turn in the artist's musical repertoire, a delightful, inspiring, and liberating term, I might say. In Monae's words, "This is our oasis made with love, rooted in self-acceptance, throbbing in self-discovery, and signed with cherry red kisses from me to you," she said in Variety. The way this era contrasts with Monae's previous works is glaring, yet also satisfying, as it can be interpreted as a warm and fulfilling conclusion to Monae's epic series that they began their musical work with. From Cindy to Jane to Janelle, the space of freedom and joy has been established. The mission has been completed, so let's celebrate. Or even in another way of thinking about it, maybe the mission has not been completed, but we're still going to celebrate. Both fit, right? What's the phrase? I forget. There's a phrase where it's like, confuse the enemy, celebrate before the battle's even won. I don't know. It's something that I may have heard in church. I'm completely butchered it, but I digress. This interpretation of Monae's musical development is what leads me to the thesis that the Age of Pleasure era is a moment of Pan-Africanist Solarpunk philosophy and practice. Unfortunately, I believe this moment has become lost because it is a vibrant moment that is happening during a time colored by capitalism, patriarchy, and cis heteronormativity. I know that's word soup, but basically, to me, from my perspective, Janelle Monae's freedom is getting misinterpreted as them succumbing to capitalism because in this era, this is when Janelle Monae has been honestly, being the most overtly sexual, if you will, and she been out here in her two-piece bikini, having fun. She said she was eating that Caribbean food, eating that oxtails, eating that good curry goat. I had some oxtails the other day and they were delicious. So I understand. Some good Caribbean food make it feel real good. Let me stop for the Caribbean folks get mad at me. I love you, Jamaica. So that aside, Janelle Monae's, dancing on top of bars in her bikini, and unfortunately, there's been criticisms of Janelle Monae. The unfortunate pattern is that when you're in entertainment or any other context under capitalism, the body and the being are displayed and or utilized for consumption to generate income or capital. And I mean, I say this like whether it's a construction worker or delivery driver that strains their body performing physical labor, the secretary or manager in corporate settings that must dress, speak, and smile a certain way for customers, clients, and supervisors, or the artists in entertainment that must create a marketable image and sound that can be packaged and sold to the masses with ease. All three examples have in common the experience of their bodies and their sense of self being dissected, analyzed, and consumed by the bastions of capitalism. All of it is performance, and if performance is deemed unsatisfactory, then there's the risk of getting chopped and discarded. So I'm compelled to ask a valid question. Are we, those of us existing and surviving this current landscape, capable of living in a world where we are liberated from the structures that weigh us down? I trust we're capable of imagining it, at least. But would we know how to be in it if it became a reality? Or would we still bring harmful patterns into the new world? This is what it comes to mind when I'm thinking about the way people, were mad at Janelle Monae. And I get it. For the longest, Janelle Monae, like I said, wore black and white tux, which is a very conservative, aesthetic, especially for a woman or especially for someone who's femme in the entertainment industry, who is, especially for someone who is perceived as a woman, right? When women, dress from head to toe, it immediately sends the message of, they're not using their body to sell an image or, quote, sell sex, if you will, end quote. But I think people don't realize that, like, by trying to pedestal the woman who is fully covered, you're still kind of assuming something. You're presuming that just because she's fully covered, that she doesn't have a sexuality as well. And you're assuming that the woman who maybe wears the leotard and wears, the cleavage showing dress and the tight dress or the loose dress, or doesn't wear the bra or anything like that, that they're selling sex, and that's the only way that you can sell records, and their talent is taking a back seat, which I don't think is fair, right? I'm thinking of an artist like Cher who would wear a whole fishnet bodysuit and a thong and a leather jacket, and she'd be up there with her mic, but her mic is on. Now, mind you, Cher comes from the 70s. Look, they was cutting up in the 70s, the 1970s, okay? Her, Tina Turner, Donna Summer, LaBelle, with Patti LaBelle and Nona Hendrix and Sarah Dash, Amy Stewart. A lot of the 1970s was cutting, the ladies was cutting up, but there was also, they were performing. There was an amazing performances. I mean, and it's nothing new in the 1970s, because the 1920s were in the same situation. Josephine Baker, which I think there were some rumors going around that Janelle Monae was going to play as Josephine Baker in a new biopic, but that fell through. But, Josephine Baker, straight out of St. Louis, she went over to Paris and would dance completely naked at times or wear a banana skirt, and made an entire career and became this legendary figure who just really shaped culture and shifted the culture. Many would have thought that she's selling sex, and there could be some validity to it, but I think that validity should be questioned as well, because it's valid if you're thinking about it from the society that you exist in. And if you exist in a society that sees the nude form as inherently sexual, that sees every nude feminine form as inherently sexual, then of course you're going to look and think there's some controversy about it. But then when you think about societies, there are whole societies where both men and women, and even they have non-binary people, they don't have taboos around being shirtless, or anything like that. Their societies are just there. They exist. There's no sexualization of breasts. There's no sexualization of nudity. The body is still respected, and it's not seen as some risque, controversial thing to just show your body in its natural state. And I'm not saying everybody needs to walk around, boot bucket naked, because I don't want to see everybody boot bucket naked. What I am saying is, I do think it's not fair that just because someone like Janelle Monae decides that they want to show their body and they want to embrace their body and be happy, and maybe they want to flash their breasts, and have fun, that somehow they're doing it just to sell records. If you only bought it because you saw Janelle Monae and her breasts, that says more about you than it does about Janelle Monae. That says more about the industry than it does about Janelle Monae. That's just how I take it. And it just really goes into the main question of, what does a free person in their body look like? Can you exist without the world looking at you and questioning it, or dissecting, saying you need to fit into this role and what's appropriate and whatnot, or you're it's just a lot, or you're not really upholding a value. People now question Janelle Monae's politics as to whether or not she's really doing something against, is she really pushing back against the patriarchy? And I'm going to say yes. I believe she still is. I believe they still are. Their body is their body. And if they choose to display and what they choose not to display is their choice. It's very much like, I think it's kind of like the conversation that would come up whenever people talked about the hijab or the burqa, and talked about how Muslim women are oppressed. And there was this one political cartoon, I gotta find it, where you have the two different women, and you have one woman who, is a Muslim woman, and she's covered from head to toe. And then, she's looking at another woman who is in a bikini or anything like that. She's showing her midriff, and she has spaghetti straps on, and I think a short skirt or something. And they're looking at each other, and they're both just look at how they're both oppressed. And it really it goes back to the question I asked earlier: what does freedom look like? Because oppression does not look the same as some people. For some people, a woman feeling like she has to show off her body, or even a man feeling like he has to show off his body and look a certain way, because those body aesthetics do affect the masculine as well as the feminine. feeling like you have to look a certain way to just be recognizable and be fit into a mold. It all looks different. The way you can be oppressed in that way. But, and even taking a step back, the oppression is in the boxes. That's the part that I don't think people grasp, right? That you're so ready to put someone in a box just because you see them take on a particular aesthetic. And because, like I said, in the beginning, when Janelle Monae was wearing tuxes, people saw Janelle Monae and questioned her sexuality. They questioned what was going on, you know. Immediately, people wondered if they were queer, but that's not fair either. You're not focusing on the music, you're still focusing on how they look. So, like, going back to my question, you know, are we capable of living in a world where we are liberated from the structures that weigh us down? Yeah, we can imagine it. Yeah, we say we want a world where everyone's free to do as they please, but would we know how to actually exist in that reality? Do we know how to put that into practice? Do we know how to put it into practice that I'm not going to judge someone or even worry about if someone is, you know, a particular orientation or anything like that, just because they choose to adorn certain clothing, right? Because that's an example of just you made this new world, but you're still bringing in that mindset that is still from the old world. And so, like, when I'm thinking about new worlds and old worlds, this is where we get to X-Men, okay? Now, again, I will also try my hardest not to make this episode a moment where I go up for X-Men as an intellectual property, because it is literally one of my favorite comics, just in general. Not even just like my favorite Marvel comics, just in general comics overall. But the aforementioned questions surrounding social and political transcendence are at the forefront of what I consider to be one of X-Men's greatest eras. It was a recent era called the Krakoa era. And it's, yeah, like the Krakoa era has the two story arcs, House of X and Powers of X, both of which were written by Jonathan Hickman and published in 2019, right before the pandemic, mind you. And just like a quick, for those who don't know, the X-Men is a comic book that focuses on a group of people that are mutants, people born genetically different and born with mutations that some of them give them superpowers like laser eyes, controlling the weather, telepathy, and then some of them just give them a physical form like blue fur and a tail and looking like a devil. Well, no, his mutation is due to the fact that he has something else. That's Nightcrawler. But, you know, or maybe they just got big feet, or they were born with wings. You know, like, those are the mutations that occur. And it's because people are mutants that it leads to humans discriminating against them and literally trying to kill them. And the X-Men are here to protect the mutants as well as humans and try to foster a peace. That's a rough premise right there. Now, Krakoa is both an island, is the name of the island. That's a living island, by the way. And it's also the name of their nation. And it's not the first instance where, like, mutants found a nation or some kind of space to call their own, separate from the world that hates and fears them. If you remember or if you've read any of the X-Men comics in the past, there was Asteroid M, you know, led by Magneto and the Acolytes, where it was this asteroid literally in space that mutants could go to, and they were supposed to be safe. And then there was also the island nation of Genosha, which was mentioned in the recent iteration of X-Men 97. It was in fact a nation itself. And there's also another version of Genosha where mutants were enslaved, but it's comic book lore. It gets convoluted at sometimes. And you've got the Morlocks. They were another part, and they were an example of like how being a mutant is not just like people with superpowers. Like, these are people who have, the Morlocks were all people who had mutations that they could not hide. And because they could not hide their mutations, it led to them being targets. And not all of them had, mutations that like were like, quote, cool mutations, end quote. Like, some of them just had scaly skin, and that was it. Literally, that was it. Like, there's nothing, you look like a lizard, and you're still getting attacked, and people think you're terrible. Mind you, that's it. You just look like a lizard. And so because they had mutations that they could not hide, the Morlocks lived in the tunnels under New York City. Meanwhile, the X-Men, all the people who were founded by Professor Charles Xavier, they lived in Charles Xavier's mansion. Now, in their defense, they did not know about the Morlocks, right? Like, the way the comics go, they didn't know about the Morlocks, but they did invite them to the mansion when they found out about them. And I think the Morlocks declined. Yeah. But as time went on, publishing time, mind you, the school of Xavier School was also including those mutants, young mutants that, that had mutations they couldn't hide, as well as those who could pass as human, if you will. But I digress. All those iterations of mutants finding a space that they felt safe from the oppression of anti-mutant sentiments, they existed. So Krakoa was not the first, but what made Krakoa so significantly different was that it didn't seem to have the flaws those other examples had. Right? Like I said, Asteroid M and Genosha were led by Magneto, and he had a history of villainy and radically aggressive methods for mutant liberation. Xavier's mansion was a space that pushed for mutants to be integrated into society that hated and feared them. Like, you're literally telling the people who that's what always got me about it. Well, I won't say always, but as I got older, I started really looking at Xavier sideways, because you're telling me you're training a group of kids who have superpowers to use their powers to defend somebody that would willingly kill them just because they have powers that they didn't ask to have. Meanwhile, the Fantastic Four get to just be celebrities. Either way, and like I said, the Morlocks were mutants that couldn't hide their mutation. So these are the issues that were with the previous, like I said, those previous iterations of mutant spaces of protection, if you will, and of peace, no matter how temporary, because the Xavier Mansion constantly fell apart. And that was kind of the issue of the also running theme of the X-Men. These spaces did not last. And so neither did Krakoa, but I'll get to that in a moment. But like Asteroid M, because Magneto was a villain, Asteroid M was stopped. I think because Magneto was gonna use Asteroid M to harm, if I recall correctly, somebody was trying to push Magneto to attack humans and thus destroy Asteroid M or destroy Magneto or cause a war between mutants and humans. Because I think Magneto at that time was like, he was tired of fighting them humans. And so somebody was trying to just do something else. Somebody in the comments will probably post the issues where they were happening. Because I remember Fabian Cortez was in that too. But that's neither here nor there. Asteroid M didn't last. Genosha didn't last. That was destroyed by Cassandra Nova, who was Charles Xavier's twin sister, evil twin sister. Long story, like most things in comics, you know, and it was destroyed in this way that was just so brutal. So brutal. Xavier's mansion was constantly getting attacked. They always knew how to find the people and destroy it. And again, the Morlocks lived in the sewer. They lived in the sewer. We don't need to talk about that. So, Krakoa, for a second, kind of felt refreshing as an X-Men fan. It just did feel refreshing at that moment until it ended as well. So, like, just to give a brief overview of the Krakoa era. Mutant kind had a paradise on the sentient island known as Krakoa that not only provided them everything they needed, shelter, food, water, medicine, community, it also helped to provide humanity with benefits in the form of medicine that extended their life and healed all diseases of the mind and the body. You know, Krakoa was producing these flowers that just really helped humanity. And they even reached a point to where mutants were able to bring life to Mars with their powers. One of my favorite moments of this era, and as well as comic book history, like literally the mutants colonized Mars. So they contributed to the economy globally, and then they like terraformed an entire planet. Just next level stuff. Now it wasn't perfect, right? The Krakoa era, they had, you know, a sadistic geneticist on the governing council who later on we found out he was infecting people's DNA with mind control agents. The nation of Krakoa was built on several lies and secrets that put the integrity of their nation at risk. And lastly, there was a bunch of time travel and figures from alternate universes that made things get messy. I don't want to spoil who was in those alternate universes. I want to say alternative universes. But if you read it, you'll find out pretty early on. You'll find out. But despite the issues, the reason why the Krakoa era resonated so much with me as like an X-Men fan and someone who exists in a few marginalized groups was because it was a moment when the people who were hated and feared got to experience not only peace, but also unbridled joy and actual freedom. It's also why it was deeply disappointing to see the island nation of Krakoa collapse the way it did. Because when I read the X-Men issue where Krakoa gets destroyed and forced several of the mutants to flee the place they called home, like they finally could call home, I couldn't help but think of the several instances in real history when a community was destroyed by those in power or just simply those in privilege. There's numerous massacres, like the Greenwood District Massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that occurred in 1921, the Rosewood Massacre in Levy County, Florida, 1923, the Trail of Tears between 1830 and 1850, and countless other moments in history when one group's home is destroyed and people are forced to be displaced. There's also another example, a very glaring example that's recent. If you know, you know. I'm going to go ahead and just say that. It also applies here. And now, while many would argue that mutants and X-Men or mutants as a concept are hardly the best metaphor for marginalization and oppression because, like I said, the X-Men members, some of them can read minds, they can shoot lasers, and heal really fast among other superpowers. I would refute that argument though, because that perception doesn't completely apply to the X-Men members, nor does it apply to the rest of mutant kind. For starters, no one can control whether or not they become a mutant. That's kind of the key aspect. People are naturally born mutants, and then their mutation manifests as a teen, which leads to the second point. No one can control how their mutation manifests. Some people's mutation manifests, with them just blowing up a whole house because they become fire powered or something like that. That's not their fault. They can't help that. But yet the world will literally hate them. Or in some cases, like I said, you've got some people who are born with wings. One of the original 5 X-Men, Angel, that's literally it. He just has avian wings. He just has wings. And then Beast, Hank McCoy, in the original, he just has big feet and looks kind of like an ape. And now he took a serum and then he ended up getting blue fur. He got blue fur from that. So now he looks more cat-like, or he just got blue fur and he's just roaming around here. That's it. And mind you, he has some super strength as well and whatnot. But and then like I said, there's X-Men that just look scaly. Or there's X-Men that just all they can do is fly. That's like the most important part. Every X-Men doesn't have a mutation like the X-Men. Like the X-Men are considered the exceptional mutants. They are the mutants that are also suffering persecution, but they make the decision to be heroes thanks to Professor X and his dream of human and mutant union. But those who hate mutants, they don't make a distinction, and neither do the methods they employ. Hence why the X-Men exist as a team. It's why the various groups found safety outside of human society as opposed to within it. Again, the Morlocks were in the sewer. I'm not going to let that go. They was living in the sewers of New York City. No offense. New York, great city. I love people who come from New York. But I don't want to live in nobody's sewers. But I especially don't want to live in the sewers. I just don't. I'll just leave it at that. And it's why, I'll just leave it at that. And it's why Krakoa represented such a beautiful moment. Because there was the other thing too. The mutants were winning, right? Yes, they had those previous iterations, but finally they were winning. And they were doing so in a way that wasn't built on the invasion and oppression of other people or the displacement of other people. Again, if you know, you know. So to see all of that greatness literally go up in flames just so the characters could return to the tired narrative of attempted genocide, was just deeply aggravating. Because it compels me to ask the crucial question: when do those who fight for their right to exist get to lay down their sword and shield and just be? That connects with my previous questions as well. Do we know what a world without oppressive systems looks like? What does it feel like? And how does it operate practically? Do we know a world where just because someone was born away, that we don't immediately go towards creating machines that massacre them and their livelihood? Do we know how to live in that type of world? So I ask these questions not because I have the answers, and I don't expect anybody listening to this to also have the answers. As always, I present these questions to get the wheels turning in our minds, as well as our hearts and our bodies, because all practices stem from an inquiry that inspired an idea to answer it. Janelle Monae presented the musical and visual oasis of Age of Pleasure because that's what they imagined when they thought of people being liberated in body and soul. You know, people of all sexualities, sexual identities, you know, genders, just being free and enjoying and having this, you know, Edenic moment. Just loved it. Also, go listen to the album. Go listen to the album too. But I digress. Hickman and the writers at Marvel Comics came together and wrote all of Mutant Kind into a scenario where they finally won. Were both of these visions perfect? No. But should they be obligated to be perfect? I don't think so. The idea that every path towards liberation is in a pristine package is unrealistic. And I also want to add, it's capital. You can even argue it's almost capitalistic sometimes. Because, and let me just point this out, like, side note, capitalism loves to put things in boxes and categories for the sake of recreation and, you could say, commodification. That's how we get instances like, what's it called? Green capitalism, or pink capitalism, or rainbow capitalism, right? Like, they'll slap a pride flag on their product while still funding money towards anything that's anti-LGBTQ+, or pink capitalism, where you'll employ women in these roles and say, hey, look, we've got women in these roles. But again, you're still funding initiatives that attack reproductive rights or that support, you know, military campaigns that destroy schools in other parts of the country and prevent young girls from getting an education in those areas. You know, like people don't think a little deeper with these things. Whenever they say they want something that's just a perfect thing, liberation is not perfect. It's organic, or it should be organic, like planting, which connects with the Solarpunk thing. This is how Solarpunk comes into mind as well. Is the sun this perfect source of energy? If you put too much sun, you can burn. We can burn in the sun. The point is, though, that the sun gives us the energy that we can use, and we use it with whatever technology we have to still create, like I said, an organic world. Nature is not easily neat. Nature is not neat. Nature does not fit in neat boxes. Wildflowers grow out. It's not a cute manicured lawn. The flowers that people like to call weeds, they're really flowers. The herbs, the trees, they all grow in twisted and winding and curved organic ways, because that's just life and that's just nature, and it doesn't always fit this linear path, and it's not obligated to. So I say all of that, like yes, we should absolutely have a practical standard for freeing ourselves completely, but we should also consider that it will not always look the exact same or look exactly the same materially for everyone or be gained the same way. And that variety is what makes up life. You know, it's just something for us to think about and to chew on, and to meditate on and ruminate. So I want y'all to consider, for this new season going into spring, you know, this is a season where we could be planting some things, where we could be nurturing some things. But in all of those moments, those are all actions. So action is still being taken. So at least ask this: what actions are we taking toward liberation? And why? So if you enjoyed this episode of Dynamic Observations, be sure to click that like button. Share the go ahead and share it if you want to, bring some people in on the conversation. And subscribe if you want to hear more. Well, because one of my actions is getting it's getting way more consistent. I don't have a set date of when I'm going to start recording or doing the episodes, but I do intend to drop more episodes this year. It goes right along with my goals for writing more. So if you enjoyed this episode, like I said, like, subscribe, share, and click the notification bell as well. And I hope everyone stays safe, stays in community, supports each other, because it's a lot going on and we need each other. No one can do this alone. So times like these, it's important to really acknowledge those who you are truly comrades with and make sure you hold on to each other and support each other as much as you can. So I pray everyone has some peace, prosperity, and power, enough to do whatever it is they're meant to do. And on that, know thyself and be blessed. See ya.